My name is Ramona Stallworth. I'm 41 years old and I watched my own mother hand my sister a real estate listing for the house my grandfather built with his bare hands. It was a Saturday in June, my parents' 40th anniversary, and the whole cookout went quiet the way a room does when everyone already knows what's coming except you. My mother walked the picnic tables with a stack of laminated sheets, passing them out like party favors, glossy photos, a price in bold at the top. The cabin out at Rough River Lake, staged with throw pillows that had never sat on that porch, listed under the words, Delia's place. My sister raised her sweet tea and said, to finally putting it to good use. People laughed. My father studied his shoes. I did not scream. I did not beg. But before that summer ended, the name on that lake house would be settled for good, and the people who laughed at my hands would learn exactly whose hands built the place. I set my paper plate down. I read the sheet once, top to bottom, the way I read a cut list before I touch a board. Then I folded it in quarters and put it in my back pocket. 41 years old, and I still knew how to keep my face like a closed drawer. Here is the thing nobody at that table understood. They thought a listing made it true. They thought the loudest voice in the family got to decide who owned what. They didn't know that, out at that cabin, screwed into a cedar window seat my grandfather built in 1971, there was a small brass plate with 2 letters on it. They'd sat on that bench for 30 years. Not one of them ever asked what the letters meant. But let me back up. This really starts a long time before that cookout. It starts with sawdust. When I was a girl, my family had a way of sorting people that nobody ever said out loud, but everybody understood. Delia was the one with the gift. She got the piano lessons, the recital dresses, the college fund that my parents fed every Christmas like it was a third child. I was the one who plays in sawdust. That was the phrase, said with a little laugh. The way you'd describe a dog that won't stay off the couch. Ramona's out in the garage again, playing in the sawdust. I was 8, the first time my grandfather, Eldon Stallworth, put a block plane in my hands and showed me how to read the grain so the wood told you which way it wanted to go. He had a shop behind his house off in the country, smelling of cedar and linseed oil, and the inside of an old coffee can he kept his pencils in. While Delia practiced scales in the front room, I learned dovetails at a bench that came up to my chin. My mother thought it was a waste. "She'll ruin her hands," she said once, not knowing I was on the stairs. My grandfather, who was in the kitchen, said back, very mild, "Hands are for ruining. That's what they're for." He never said I love you the way other grown-ups did in big, sloppy sentences. He said it in lumber. He'd hand me an offcut of walnut and say, "Feel that. That's 100 years old. You can't fake 100 years." And once, fitting a drawer that wouldn't quite seat, he tapped the underside where nobody would ever look and said a thing I didn't understand for 30 more years. "The good wood's always underneath, Ramona. Remember that. The pretty face is on the outside. The good wood's always underneath." I grew up and did the unforgivable thing, which was to make a living with those ruined hands. I'm a Finnish carpenter. Cabinets, built-ins, stairs, the kind of work that takes patience and shows it. I live in Owensboro, in a narrow shotgun house off Triplet Street with sawdust on the porch boards, no matter how many times I sweep. It is not a fancy life, but every door in it closes right, and there is something to be said for that. Delia stayed close, the way she'd tell it. She married a man named Greg who sold something different every 2 years, and she kept up appearances. Nice cars in the driveway, a kitchen renovation she put on the internet. She came to every Sunday dinner and laughed at my father's same 4 jokes, and my parents loved her for being there, which is a thing they were never able to love me for, because I was always out somewhere swinging a hammer for money. You know the type, the daughter who calls it devotion right up until devotion costs her something. My grandfather built the cabin at Rough River Lake in 1971, the year before my father was born, on a gravel turn the locals call Tamarack Road. He cut a lot of the lumber himself. It is not a big place. 2 rooms, a stone chimney, a porch that looks out over the water, and a window seat under the front window that he dovetailed by hand from cedar, with a lid that lifts so you can store life jackets and old quilts inside. There was a closet built into the back wall, cedar-lined, that he kept padlocked my entire life. We asked him once what was in it, and he said mine, and that was the end of the conversation. When he passed, 11 years ago now, the padlock was still on it. Nobody could find a key. My father pried at it once with a screwdriver, got nowhere, and let it be. After the funeral, the cabin just sort of drifted into being everyone's and no one's. My parents used it a few weekends a summer. Delia threw a couple of parties out there. I went out alone, mostly in the off-season, and oiled the bench and tightened what had come loose, because a building that's loved keeps its squareness, and a building that's ignored starts to rack and sag, and I couldn't stand to watch his joints open up. I'd sit on the cedar seat with my coffee and run my thumb over that little brass plate screwed into the front of it. 2 letters, R.S. Everyone in the family, the few times it came up, said the same thing. That's for Ruth. Grandpa put that on for Grandma. Ruth was his wife, who died before I was born. Ruth Stallworth, R.S. It made sense. It made so much sense that nobody ever looked closer. I looked closer plenty of times. I just never said anything, because I had no reason to yet, and because the men in my family talk and the women in my family endure, and I had learned a long time ago which one kept its dignity. So, the cookout. I drove out to my parents' the next afternoon, the folded listing sheet still in my back pocket because I am not a coward, and I wanted to hear it said plain, to my face in a kitchen, with no audience to perform for. My mother was washing the good glasses. My father was at the table with the newspaper he still buys. I saw the listing, I said. My mother didn't turn around. It's the practical thing, Ramona. That cabin just sits there. Delia and Greg can actually do something with it. It's Grandpa's cabin. It's the family's cabin, my father said, in the voice he used to end discussions. And the family decided. Your sister's in a position to make use of it. You've got your little house and your work. You don't need a lake place. He turned a page. It's Delia's now. We've talked it through. The sale money helps her and Greg get square, and frankly, it's about time something went her way after all she does for this family. All she does for this family. I let that sit in the air a second. I thought about 30 years of oiling a bench nobody else remembered to touch. Is there paperwork? I asked. On the cabin. A deed. A will. My mother finally turned around, drying her hands on a towel, and gave me the look she'd given me my whole life. The one that says, you wouldn't understand the grown folks' business. Your father has it handled. It went through the estate when Daddy passed. It's all in order. She said it the way you'd reassure a child that the noise in the attic is nothing. Honey, why are you making this hard? You play in sawdust. Let Delia have something nice for once. There it was, 50-something years old in my heart and back to 8 years old on the stairs in one sentence. Okay, I said. That's all. I didn't argue. I have learned that the louder a thing is, the easier it is to argue with, and I had no intention of giving them anything to argue with. I drove home to Owensboro with the windows down and the river on my right, and I did not cry, which surprised me a little. What I felt wasn't grief. It was something closer to the feeling you get when a board you thought was square turns out to be off by a 16th, and you realize you've been building on it the whole time, and now you finally get to set down your tools and go check. Because here is what my father did not say, and I'm fairly sure did not know. He said it went through the estate. He said it was all in order. But a will only governs what a person owns when they die, and there are ways to move a thing out of an estate before you ever die, quietly, through the county, with a stamp and a recording fee, so that it never belongs to the estate at all. My grandfather was a careful man who didn't trust talk and trusted paper. He recorded things. I had watched him do it more than once, standing at a counter while a clerk pressed a stamp onto a document. I didn't say any of that in the kitchen. I just said, okay, and went home and slept better than I had in weeks. The for sale sign went up at Rough River Lake 9 days later. I know because Hetty Combs called me, an old widow who lives 2 docks down from the cabin and has known our family her whole life. Ramona, she said, there's a real estate fella out here pounding a sign into Eldon's yard, red and white one, says open house Sunday. Did you all sell the place? I told her not yet. I told her to sit tight. There was a pause on the line, and then Hetty said something I'd think about a lot in the weeks after. That's not right, you know. Your granddad told me more than once that cabin was spoken for. Said the right person already had it, they just didn't know it yet. She laughed a little. I figured he meant the Lord. Old people talk like that. I thanked her and hung up and stood in my kitchen a long while. The next morning, I didn't drive to the lake to look at the sign, which is what my whole body wanted to do. I drove downtown instead to the county building, the squat brick one with the flag out front, because my grandfather had taught me that you don't fix a racked frame by yelling at it. You go find the one joint that's wrong and you make it true. And there is a counter in that building, in an office that smells like dust and old coffee and the particular patience of public records, where a woman would look up from her screen, recognize my last name before I'd finish saying it, and tell me something that turned the whole summer over on its hinges. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me tell you about the woman behind that counter and what my grandfather's hands had been doing in that office 20 years before, on an afternoon nobody in my family ever knew about. The county recorder's office in Owensboro sits on the second floor of that brick building on Frederica Street, up a staircase with a brass rail worn pale in the middle from 100 years of hands. I had been there before, years back, pulling permits for a kitchen job, and I remembered the way the room held quiet, the way a church does on a weekday. There was a long counter with a swinging gate, and behind it, rows of flat steel cabinets that hold the deeds and the plats and the liens, the whole skeleton of who owns what in Daviess County, going back further than anybody living. The woman behind the counter was a tall woman, about my mother's age, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a cardigan even in June, because those old buildings keep their cool. The little nameplate by her terminal said Okafor. I said I needed to look up a property out at Rough River Lake, and I gave her the road, Tamarack, and I started to give her the year, and she stopped me with one finger raised. Not rude, just certain, the way you'd stop a saw before it bound up. Stallworth, she said. Not a question. She was looking at my face. You'd be one of Eldon's. It took the wind clean out of me. I said, yes, ma'am. His granddaughter, Ramona. She took her glasses off and let them fall on the chain, and she looked at me a good long moment, the way my grandfather used to look at a board before he decided what it would become. I knew your grandfather, she said. Long time ago now. I was new here, barely knew the drawers from the dockets. There was a man came in one afternoon, country man, clean shirt, hands like roots, and he had a document already drawn up, already notarized, and he wanted it recorded that same day. Wouldn't leave it in the drop. Stood right where you're standing and watched me stamp it and watch me file it and asked me to read him back the book and page number so he could write it in a little notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. She smiled, just barely. Most folks can't be bothered. They sign and they're gone. That man wanted to see the gears turn. I never forgot him. My heart was going hard, but I kept my hands flat and easy on the counter. Do you remember what it was? The document. I remember it wasn't an ordinary deed, she said. I remember thinking, this is a careful man. This is a man planning something the quiet way. She put her glasses back on. But I don't have to remember, honey, and neither do you. That's the whole beauty of this office. We don't run on remembering. We run on what's recorded. She turned to her screen and her fingers went to the keys. Let's go pull the paper. If your granddad recorded something on that parcel, it's been sitting in that cabinet this whole time, waiting on somebody to come ask. You already hold the paper, Ramona. You just have to come pull it. I want to stop here and tell you what those words did to me because it matters. My whole life in my family, the truth of a thing was whatever got said loudest at the table. Delia said the cabin was hers. My mother backed her. My father closed the discussion, and that became the weather we all lived in. And here was a stranger in a cardigan, telling me that there was a place in the world where the loud voice didn't win, where a thing was true because it was filed, stamped, dated, witnessed, and laid in a drawer, and no toast at a cookout could touch it. I had spent 41 years believing I had no standing in my own family. And Ms. Okafor was telling me that standing wasn't something they handed you. It was something you went and pulled. She typed for a while. She frowned at the screen and typed some more. The parcel pulled up under the family, the way I expected, with a string of older entries going back to the original conveyance in the 60s, when my grandfather bought the land. And then she went still, and she leaned in toward the screen, and she said, very softly, the way you do when a thing is more interesting than you let on. There's an instrument here, she said slowly, recorded. It's a transfer on death deed. She looked at me over the top of her glasses. You know what that is? I said I thought I did. I said it was a way to pass property to somebody when you die without it going through the will. Without it going through the estate at all, she corrected gently, like a teacher who wants you to get the word exactly right. It's its own animal. A person can record one of these, naming who the property goes to on their death, and they can keep living there, keep using it, never tell a living soul. And when they pass, the property goes straight to the named beneficiary. It doesn't become part of the estate. The will never touches it. The executor never touches it. It was never theirs to divide. She tapped the screen. This one was recorded a good while back, long before your grandfather passed, by the look of the date. The room felt very far away and very close at the same time. I asked her, and I kept my voice as level as a poured floor, who it named. She clicked. She read. And then she did a thing I will remember the rest of my life. She took her glasses off again, and she folded them in her hand, and she looked at me with something soft moving behind her eyes. I think, she said, you ought to order the certified copy and read it yourself. It's not my place to tell you what's on a man's deed, but honey, she paused. I don't think you came down here for nothing. I ordered the certified copy. It cost me a few dollars and 3 business days, and walking back down that worn staircase, I felt like I was carrying something hot in both hands, even though my hands were empty. I did not let myself believe it yet. I have hung enough doors to know that the gap you hope for and the gap you measure are 2 different things, and only the tape tells the truth. So I told myself nothing. I drove home to Triplet Street and I went out to my shop, which is just the back half of the house with the wall knocked through, and I did what I always do when my chest is too full. I made something. I cut and fit a small drawer for a customer's spice cabinet, half-blind dovetails, and I worked until the light went orange in the window and the only sound was the whisper of the plane and the tick of the wood cooling. And somewhere in there, my hands settled even though the rest of me hadn't. While I waited on the copy, I drove out to the lake. I told myself it was to check on the cabin. That was half true. But mostly, I needed to sit on that bench. I parked on the gravel of Tamarack Road, past the for sale sign that some stranger had pounded into my grandfather's yard, red and white, with a smiling face on it that had never once felt cedar dust under its fingernails. The lake was flat and silver that evening, and a heron stood out on the end of the dock like it owned the deed itself. I went up onto the porch and I let myself in, and there it was, the way it had been my whole life. The window seat under the front window, cedar, gone honey dark with age and oil, the grain like water under glass. My grandfather's hand was all over it, in the way the boards met, in the lid that lifted on a piano hinge he'd let into the wood so clean you had to feel for the seam. And on the front of it, screwed in with 4 brass screws, the little plate, R period, S period. I had run my thumb over those 2 letters 1,000 times. Ruth, everyone said, for Grandma Ruth. But I sat down on that bench in the failing light, and for the first time in my life, I let myself ask the question I had always swallowed. If it was for Ruth, who died in this house and was mourned in this house, why had he never once said so? My grandfather narrated everything he built. He'd tell you the year of the tree. He'd tell you the man he bought the hinges from. But this plate, the one supposedly honoring the wife he loved, he never spoke of. Not once. And a man does not stay silent about the thing he is proudest of. He stays silent about the thing he is hiding. I ran my hands over the joinery the way I have run them over 10,000 joints, and that was when I started to see it. You have to understand how I see. Where my family saw a bench, I saw decisions, and the decisions did not add up. The seat was deeper, front to back, than it needed to be for sitting. The apron underneath was thicker than the load called for, and when I knocked along the underside with 2 knuckles, the way you'd thump a wall for a stud, the sound changed about a third of the way back, solid, and then a small dead hollow where there had no business being one. My grandfather did not waste wood. He did not overbuild for vanity. Every board in that man's work earned its keep. There was no reason on God's earth for that cavity to exist, unless the cavity was the reason and the bench was just the thing built to hold it. I sat back. My pulse was loud in my ears. The good wood's always underneath Ramona. He'd said it to me at his bench when I was a girl, fitting a drawer, tapping the place nobody would ever look. I had thought it was a saying. A bit of country wisdom about character, about how the pretty face doesn't matter and the true grain is hidden. I had carried it around for 30 years as a feeling, and only now, sitting in the dark on his bench with my knuckles still tingling from the hollow, did I understand he hadn't been speaking in pictures at all. He'd been telling me, plainly, where he'd put it, but he just trusted that the one person who'd understand the sentence would be the one person who'd ever bother to knock. I did not open it that night. I want to be honest about that because I think it surprises people. I had found the hollow and I had the screwdriver in my truck and I could have backed those 4 screws out right there in the dark with my phone in my teeth for light. But I didn't. Some things you don't do by flashlight, alone, with your hands shaking. Some things you do square, in daylight, knowing exactly what you hold. And I didn't yet hold the paper. I had 3 more business days to wait on the county, so I screwed nothing loose. I sat a while longer with my grandfather's work under me and the heron on the dock and the listing sign glowing faintly in the last light like a thing that did not belong, and then I locked up and drove home. But on the way to the truck, I stopped. Because the sign had bothered me from the moment I saw it, and I finally understood why. There was a flyer in a little plastic box screwed to the post, the glossy listing sheets, same as the ones my mother had handed out at the cookout. I took one. I sat in my truck with the dome light on, and I looked at the photographs, the staged ones, the throw pillows, and I came to the wide shot of the front room, the one that showed the whole space with the window and the water beyond it. And I went cold, because in that photograph, the bench had been moved. My grandfather had built it as a built-in, fixed to the wall, sitting square on 2 marks he'd scribed into the floorboards in pencil 50 years ago. Marks I had oiled around so many times, I knew them like the lines in my own palm. And in the listing photo, the bench sat a good hand's width off those marks, shoved out from the wall, and turned the smallest bit askew, the way a thing sits when somebody has pulled it out to look behind it and shoved it back in a hurry, not caring or not knowing that it had ever had a true place to begin with. Somebody had moved it. Somebody had already had their hands on my grandfather's bench, and I sat there in the dark of my truck with the dome light burning and one cold question turning over and over in my chest. Had they found it? Or was it still sealed, still waiting, still holding its breath under that false floor for the one person who knew to knock? I drove home that night with the listing flyer on the seat beside me like a thing I'd caught and couldn't decide whether to keep, and I did not sleep much. I lay in my narrow room off Triplet Street with the window open and the box fan turning, and I listened to the trains go through the way they do in Owensboro, that long, low call out past the flood wall, and I turned the question over and over. Had somebody found the hollow? Had they pried up that false bottom and taken what was inside and shoved the bench back crooked and never thought twice? Or had they only moved it to stage a photograph, to clear the line of sight to the water for a wide-angle lens, never knowing they'd nudged a 50-year-old secret a hand's width off its marks? I told myself I would know when I knew, and not before. That is a carpenter's patience, and it has saved me more grief than any other thing my grandfather gave me. You do not guess at a measurement. You do not eyeball a miter and hope. You wait for the number, and the number tells you the truth, and you cut once. So I waited on the county. 3 business days. And in those 3 days, while the certified copy made its slow way through whatever drawer and machine and mail tray stood between me and the answer, 2 people came to my door that I had not expected, and each of them handed me a piece of a man I thought I'd known my whole life. The first was an old woman named Hetty Combs. She came on a Tuesday morning, driven by a grandson in a dusty truck, and she stood on my porch in the sawdust with a foil-covered plate in her 2 hands like an offering. She was small and bent, and her eyes were the milky blue of someone who'd looked at a lot of water in her life. And she said, "You're Eldon's girl, the one with the hands." I'd had that said about me my whole life as a small thing, a way of setting me below the ones with the piano and the diplomas, and it had always landed like a splinter. But the way Hetty Combs said it, it sounded like the finest thing a person could be. The one with the hands, like it was a title. I asked her in and she wouldn't sit, but she set the plate down on my kitchen table. Lemon bars, still warm, and she told me why she'd come. "I heard they're selling the lake place," she said. "Heard it at the church. And I couldn't let that sign go up and not come tell somebody what kind of man built it." She had a place 3 coves down from my grandfather's, she said. Had it 40 years. After her husband passed, there'd been a stretch where she couldn't keep up, where the dock went soft and the taxes came due, and she didn't have it, and she was too proud to say a word to a living soul. And one fall, she came out to close the place for winter, and the dock was rebuilt. New stringers, new decking, every board screwed down square, a little ramp put in so she could get down to the water without her hip giving out. No note, no bill. She thought maybe the county had done it, or some church fund, until the spring she happened to be out at dawn and saw a truck she knew, and a tall old man on his knees on her dock with a cordless drill, fixing a board that had worked loose over the winter, quiet as a heron, thinking nobody was up to see. "I never let on I saw him," she said. "I knew he didn't want me to. A man like that, you don't embarrass him by saying thank you. You just keep his secret and you pray for him." Her milky eyes filled up and she pressed her lips together. "And there was the taxes, the year I couldn't. I went down to pay what I could scrape, and the woman at the window said it was already settled. Anonymous," she said. "I knew. I always knew. But I never said." She put her hand flat on my kitchen table, over the lemon bars, like she was swearing on them. "So when I heard they're putting his place up for strangers to buy, I had to come tell you. There was nothing ordinary about your granddad. Nothing. He took care of people the quiet way, and he never once let his right hand know what his left was doing." I walked her back to her grandson's truck, and I stood in my driveway a long time after the dust settled. The quiet way. He took care of people the quiet way. I had spent my whole life thinking I was the overlooked one, the one nobody planned for, and here was the first crack of light coming in under a door I hadn't known was there. The second visitor came the very next evening, and he came not to my door, but to my shop window. His name was Tobias. He was maybe 23, lean as a fence rail, with that careful way of standing that young men have when they badly want to be useful and aren't sure they're allowed. He'd heard, the way the whole county seemed to have heard, that I was the one going through Eldon Stallworth's things. He stood at my open shop door in the orange light, and he looked at the half-blind dovetails I had clamped up drying, and his whole face changed, the way a face does when it sees the thing it loves. Mr. Eldon paid for my trade school, he said. 2 years at the Votech over in Henderson, carpentry and millwork. He said it fast, like he'd been holding it. My mama couldn't, and I sure couldn't, and one day there was just a letter said it was taken care of and a phone number, and the number was a man wouldn't tell me his name for the longest time. But I figured it out. I used to see him at the lumber yard. He'd ask me what I was learning. He'd say, "Don't let anybody tell you a trade is a lesser thing. A man who can make is never poor." Tobias swallowed. He passed before I could finish. I never got to pay him back. So when I heard you needed help going through that cabin, I drove straight over. Whatever you need lifted or hauled or torn out, I'm your man, free. It's the only way I've got to say thank you to a dead man. I hired him on the spot, and I told him I'd pay him too, because my grandfather would have wanted it done right, and a man who can make is never poor, but he still ought to be paid. And the next morning, Tobias and I drove out together to Tamarack Road, because the certified copy still hadn't come, and I had decided there was one thing at that cabin I could open before the paper arrived. Not the bench. I'd promised myself the bench would wait for daylight and certainty both. But there was something else out there that had been locked my whole life, and I had finally let myself admit I'd never once questioned why. The cedar closet. In the back room of that cabin, built into the corner the way the bench was built into the front, my grandfather had made a cedar closet, a tall, narrow thing lined in aromatic red cedar that he kept padlocked. Always. My whole childhood. We were told it was where the good quilts went, and the important papers, and we were told it the way you tell children a thing so they'll quit asking, and we quit asking. I never in 41 years saw the inside of that closet, and it had taken a stranger's foil plate of lemon bars and a young man's debt to a dead man for me to finally hear how strange that was. A man who hid kindness behind anonymous tax payments and rebuilt docks at dawn. A man who built a safe into a bench. Of course, the padlocked closet meant something. Of course it did. The padlock was old, but the hasp was soft pine, and I'll be honest, my grandfather would have laughed at how easy it came. I backed the screws out of the hasp rather than break anything, because I do not break my grandfather's work, and the door swung open on the smell of cedar, so strong and so much like him, that Tobias, behind me, said "Lord" very softly, and took his cap off without seeming to know he'd done it. There were quilts. There were the important papers, deeds to nothing much, an old truck title, insurance from a company that didn't exist anymore. And down at the bottom, under a folded quilt, there was a wooden box he'd made, finger-jointed, no finish on it, just raw and true. And inside the box was a ledger. A ledger. A simple cloth-bound account book, the kind they sell at the drugstore. And in it, in my grandfather's square pencil hand, page after page, were names, dates, small amounts, Hetty C., Doc and the fall taxes, a boy's full name I recognized as Tobias's, and beside it, Votech, 2 years, a family I'd never heard of, furnace, January, a girl, books and bus, a man, back rent so he don't lose the place. Page after page going back 25 years, the quiet arithmetic of a man who had decided early that the measure of a life was what you made and what you gave, and who had told exactly no one. And on the last written page, near the bottom, in the same square pencil, one line that stopped my heart in my chest. It said, R. See the bench. She'll know, R, not Ruth. Ruth had been gone a long time when this ledger was started. R was me. R was the granddaughter with the hands. He had written me a note in a ledger he hid in a closet he padlocked, trusting that someday, when it mattered, the one person who took care of things the quiet way would come looking and would understand the sentence when she found it. The good woods always underneath. I had thought it was wisdom. It had been an instruction the whole time, and a love letter, and a key. Tobias had gone quiet behind me. I closed the ledger, and I held it against my chest with both hands, and I looked across the back room toward the front of the cabin, toward the window seat sitting a hand's width off its marks in the gray morning light, and I knew the paper was going to come. and I knew what it was going to say, and I was no longer afraid that someone had gotten there first. Because a man who plans like this, a man who hides the key in 3 places so the right person finds at least one, that man does not get outwitted by a sister with a real estate agent and a price already set. The certified copy was waiting in my mailbox when we drove back to Triplet Street that afternoon. A plain manila envelope with the county seal in the corner. I did not open it in the truck. I carried it inside and I set it on the kitchen table next to Hetty Combs's empty plate. And I washed the cedar dust off my hands, and I made myself a cup of coffee I didn't drink, and only then did I sit down and slide my thumb under the flap. And there it was. A transfer on death deed for the parcel on Tamarack Road, Rough River Lake, Daviess County, Kentucky. Recorded. Stamped. Dated 11 years before my grandfather passed, naming in the careful language of a man who'd stood at that counter and watched the woman stamp it and asked her to read him back the book and page so he could write it in the notebook in his shirt pocket. One beneficiary, Ramona Stallworth. Not the estate, not the will, not the loud voice at the table, me. It had been mine from 11 years before he died. It had been mine through every cookout where they called the cabin Delia's. It had been mine while my mother handed out laminated sheets and my sister toasted to putting it to good use. The whole time, mine. I sat at my kitchen table with that paper in my 2 hands, and I did not cry, and I did not call anyone, and I did not drive to the lake. I read it 3 times until I knew every line of it the way I know the marks, scribed in that cabin floor. Then I set it down, flat, and I smoothed it once with the side of my hand, the way you'd smooth a board to feel for the grain, and I picked up my phone and I started making the calls that would settle the name on that lake house for good. The first one was to the family, because there was going to be a reckoning at that cabin, and I wanted every one of them standing in the front room when I opened the bench. They came on a Saturday because that was the day Delia kept clear for what she called family. I had asked them all out to the cabin, and I had asked them in the plain, flat voice I use when I am giving a customer a number they won't like, so that nobody could read anything in it. My mother came in her good slacks. My father came behind her, quiet the way he'd gotten quiet in his old age, a man who had spent 40 years letting the loud people in his house do the deciding. And Delia came last, in sunglasses she didn't take off on the porch, with a leather folio under her arm that I knew held the listing papers, and probably a contract she was hoping to get signed before the week was out. Tobias was already there. I'd brought him along and set him to oiling the door hinges, and he stood off to the side of the front room with a rag in his hand and his cap off, the way you stand at a funeral, because he understood before any of them did that something was about to be set right. "Well," Delia said, pushing her sunglasses up into her hair and looking around the front room like an appraiser. "I'm glad you've come around, Ramona. I really am. I know this place means something to you, the little kid stuff, the summers. But sentiment doesn't pay a note, and somebody in this family has to be the grown-up about the numbers." She set the folio down on the cedar bench. On the bench. She set her papers down on the very thing she was about to lose, and she did not feel it. And that told me everything about how far apart we'd always lived. I did not answer her right away. I have learned that the quiet between a question and its answer is a tool like any other, and I have learned to let it do its work. I crossed the room and I picked her folio up off the bench, gentle, and I handed it back to her, and I knelt down at the end of the window seat where the cedar met the wall. "Before anybody signs anything," I said, "I want to show you who built this." "We know who built it," my mother said. "Daddy built it. Everybody knows that." "No," I said. I want to show you how I know." I ran my thumb along the underside lip of the seat to the place where the wood was joined, and I turned my head so they could see me looking and not feeling. These are half-blind dovetails, hand-cut. You can tell a hand-cut tail from a machine, one by the way the pins come off the line, just barely fat at the shoulder, the way a person cuts when they're cutting to a scribe instead of a jig. And down here, where nobody was ever meant to look unless they got down on the floor like this, There's a mark burned into the wood, a maker's mark, a little stamp he had made the year he turned 30, an E and an S inside a square. The square being a carpenter's square, which was his joke, his signature, his way of saying, a Stallworth made this and a Stallworth meant it to last. I touched it. He put that mark on the bench, and he put the very same mark on one other thing in this world, which I have carried in my apron pocket every working day for 30 years and never once understood until last week. I took the plumb bob out of my pocket and I held it up so the light from the window ran down the brass. The little weight he'd given me when I was 11, the one I'd thought was just a tool, just a thing for finding the true vertical of a thing. I turned it so they could read the word he'd had engraved up near the string. Find true. And underneath the word, so small you'd never look for it unless you knew, the E and the S inside the square. He gave me this and told me to find true, I said. I thought he meant in my work. He meant it about a lot more than that. Delia laughed, but it came out thin. Ramona, this is a beautiful little speech, but I don't see what a stamp on the bottom of a bench has to do with... He didn't just sign the bench, I said. He built it to hold something. I looked up at her. And I think you already know that, because somebody's had this bench off its marks. The color went out of her face the way water goes out of a sink. I reached into my apron and I took out my driver. 4 brass screws hold the seat lid down, countersunk and waxed, and I have backed out screws set by my grandfather's hand often enough to know his torque, the way you know a person's handwriting. And I backed them out one at a time and set them in a row on the windowsill, 4 small suns in the lake light. Then I lifted the lid. Inside was the shallow box everyone had always known about, the one we'd kept life jackets in, faded orange things gone stiff with age. I lifted those out and handed them to Tobias, and then I did the thing none of them knew was there to do. I pressed my 2 thumbs into the back corners of that box, where the grain ran a hair off true, where the bottom sat a finger too high for the depth of the seat, the discrepancy I had measured with a tape 3 nights running until the number told me the truth, and the false bottom came up on its hidden rabbit with a small, dry sigh, 50 years of cedar breathing out at once. Underneath was a tobacco tin, sealed at the seam with a band of wax he'd melted himself. Holland House, the lid said, a brand that hadn't been sold in my lifetime. The room had gone very still. My father had taken a step closer without seeming to know he'd done it. My mother had her hand at her throat. Delia stood frozen with her folio against her chest like a shield, and I understood, looking at her, that she had moved this bench. She had pulled it out from the wall to clear the window for the photographer's wide shot, and she had felt nothing under her hands, no hollow, no secret, because she did not have the hands to feel it. She had been a finger's width from the truth and walked right past it, the way she'd walked past me my whole life. I broke the wax seal with my thumbnail. Inside the tin, folded in oilcloth, was a single document, and I unfolded it slow, and I read it out loud in the flat, quiet voice, every word, the way I'd promised myself I would. A transfer on death deed, Davie S. County, the parcel on Tamarack Road, 1 beneficiary, Ramona Stallworth. Stamped by the recorder's office, dated 11 years before he passed. That's not real, Delia said, but her voice had no floor under it. That's not, Mama. Tell her that's not how it works. You can't just... It's recorded, I said. That's the whole of it, Delia. That's the thing you never understood about him and never understood about me. You list a thing when you want strangers to bid on it. I held the deed up, level, the way you'd hold a level. He didn't list it. He recorded it. Nobody said anything. The lake moved against the dock outside, and a bird went over, and my father made a sound I had never heard my father make, a kind of broken breath, and he said, "So low I almost missed it," he told me once, years back. He said he'd seen to it that the one who'd keep it would keep it. I thought he was rambling. I'm an old fool. I thought he was just rambling. I learned, in the days after, the shape of the rest of it, the way you learn a room in the dark by touching the walls. Delia had a second mortgage on her house in town and a line of credit drawn down to the last dollar, and she had pledged this cabin that was never hers, against money she had already spent. She had not been cruel to me out of nothing. She had been drowning, and she had reached for the nearest solid thing, and the nearest solid thing had my name recorded under it for 11 years. I did not feel the triumph I'd thought I would. I mostly felt how long we'd both been carrying weights we never told each other about, hers in a bank and mine in my chest. The procedure was its own quiet thing, and I did it the way my grandfather would have, one true step at a time. I drove back to the county office and I sat across from Ms. Okafor, the deputy recorder who'd told me weeks before that I already held the paper and only had to come pull it. And she looked at the deed and she looked at me over her glasses and she said, "I knew that man's hand the second I saw it. He stood right where you're sitting." She helped me file a quiet title action, the legal mechanism that takes a thing that is true and makes it loud enough that no court and no lender can ever pretend otherwise. The listing came down off the market that same week. I watched the sign get pulled off the gravel turn myself, the little metal feet of it leaving 4 holes in the dirt that I filled in with the toe of my boot. And Delia's lender got a letter on county paper informing them that the collateral they'd been promised had never belonged to the person who promised it. That part was not revenge. That part was just the truth doing what truth does when you finally let it stand up straight. And then I did the thing I had decided on the night I read his ledger by lamplight, the thing that turned out to be the only ending I could live with. I had the lawyer draw up a life tenancy. I signed the cabin so that my mother and my father could live out their days at the lake if they wanted it, and so that Delia, even Delia, would always have a roof at Rough River when the bank was done with her in town, but with one clause set in it, like a brass screw set in cedar. The place could never be sold. Not by me, not by my children, not by anybody who came after. I took the one asset my sister had tried to turn into fast cash, and I made it into a thing that could never be cashed at all. He had built a safe to protect it for one summer. I built a fence around it for good. There was one more thing, and I did it alone. And I told no one, and I will only tell it now because it is the part he would have wanted, told least, and meant most. Tobias had a younger cousin, a girl of 14 out in the county who was forever taking the toaster apart to see how it worked and forever getting told to go help in the kitchen instead. I drove out to the Votech in Henderson, and I set up an account in her name, anonymous the way it had been done for the boy oiling my hinges, the way it had been done for the widow 3 coves down. I put my grandfather's maker's mark on the welcome letter, the E and the S inside the square, and no name. Someday she'll get down on her knees in front of something a person built, and she'll feel the hollow the rest of the world walks past, and she'll go looking. The last day at the cabin, I sent everyone home. I stayed with Tobias, and we set the bench back square on the 2 pencil marks scribed into the floor 50 years ago, dead on, until the seat sat the way it was meant to sit. I rubbed a little linseed into the brass plate that everyone in my family had spent 30 years believing said Ruth, and held it to the light and read what it had always said. R.S. I drove the 4 screws home, his torque, my hand. I took my block and a sheet of fine paper, and I sanded the seat smooth where 1,000 summers had worn it until the cedar came up warm and bright, and the afternoon light came off the lake and lay along the grain like something poured. I'm Ramona Stallworth, 41, and rooted for good.